Hi, everyone. Thank you guys so much for coming. I cannot say how excited I am to listen to these three people talk about their research here. I'm just obsessed with our planet, and these three people are working to protect it and make it better. And yeah, just I think the best thing you can do with data science. So without further ado, I'm just going to let them launch into telling you a little bit about what their work is and what they're doing right now. Up first, we have Abigail Bodner.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be here. I think I'm going to stand here so I can see my slides. So I'm an assistant professor at MIT. I have a shared position between the Earth Atmospheric and Planetary Sciences Department and the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. So my work spans kind of both of those different realms. As you probably are learning to appreciate today, the climate system is very complex. It involves a lot of interactions on a wide range of scales between the atmosphere, the ocean, land, biology, anthropogenic forcing. And my work involves trying to understand the ocean's role in the large-scale climate, and in particular, how we can understand physical processes that fall below what we think of as the ideal climate grid scale to try to improve the large-scale climate variability by accounting for physics that are too small to be resolved. As we think of projections into the future and how the climate might change, you may notice that there's a very wide range of possibilities depending on both different emission scenarios, but also different model projections. And the reason for that uncertainty actually lies in what falls below the grid scale. So a lot of the unresolved physics in particular and the ocean-atmosphere interface, which determines the carbon uptake and the heat transport, all of that gets determined by physics that we can't resolve in the climate models. So just to emphasize this point a little further, this is an example from a North Atlantic ocean simulation at a resolution of 100 kilometers. So you can see that Boston isn't resolved in this grid to give you kind of an estimate of how large this is. And I'm going to try to, it doesn't. Okay, I'll just walk through it. So this is surface temperature, and we normally are used to see like the Gulf Stream and certain vortices that we know exist in the ocean, but that doesn't come out in that first coarse resolution simulation. The image below that is what we think of as the next generation of ocean models. It's a 10-kilometer resolution, so we have a lot more variability, as we can see. If we zoom in even further, this is now showing the rotation of the flow. So these are cool images that I like to look at and understand the physics of the flow. There's a lot more variability, a lot more information that's being shown here. And if we zoom in even further, this is a 500-meter resolution simulation. And only now we're starting to resolve the processes that I'm interested in. So a lot of the questions that my group tries to answer is what is the important physical process that is being shown in the high resolution data, and how can we quantify that to then go back into the coarse resolution model to improve the long-term projections. We're very limited in observational data in the ocean. It's unlike the atmosphere where we can use a lot of satellite measurements and balloons. In the ocean, you actually have to go and throw something in the water to get something to measure within the in situ data. We also use satellite imagery, but those are only becoming more powerful for the ocean. So on the left here, we can see examples of all sorts of different ways that we can capture data from the ocean, whereas on the right, this is the global distribution of the information we have. So it may seem like it's very dense, but in fact, between every 2 points, we could have hundreds of kilometers. So we're very limited. My group focuses on trying to understand upper ocean turbulence, and we use different types of simulations at different resolutions. We use observations given from satellites, and we use in situ measurements, and we try to combine all the above using theory and AI in order to improve the projections in the long term. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Loretta Mickley. I'm a senior research fellow at Harvard. I'm an atmospheric chemist, and I'll talk a little bit about our work on wildfires and smoke and how data science can reveal how much climate change is actually driving wildfires. And I've been working with a really fantastic group of people, and I wanted to acknowledge them with their pictures on this very first slide. They're a really dynamic group consisting of undergraduates, graduate students, postdocs, and other collaborators. So I'm an atmospheric chemist. What do? We actually study very tiny particles in the air and what we call short-lived gases that may last as much as 9 years, but maybe just seconds. We're interested in smog and the greenhouse gas methane, and also the smoke from wildfires. And we work with both models of the atmosphere and as many observations as we can. And in the upper right, you can see the kinds of measurements we use: satellite, aircraft, field measurements, and also measurements in the lab. And then we work with epidemiologists to understand the health effects of breathing these particles or gases. What happens when these tiny particles invade the body and get down into the lungs, and the tiniest particles can even get into your bloodstream and your brain. And some of the challenges are, first of all, these observations are multiplying rapidly. There are a lot of satellites up in the atmosphere now. And the second problem is the models are becoming more and more complex. And so what we call machine learning can help us analyze all these observations and improve our models. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the kinds of 3D models that we use, not unlike what Abigail just showed a few minutes ago. We divide up the atmosphere into small grid cells, not just as one layer, but many layers going up into the atmosphere. And inside each grid cell, we want to describe the emissions, the chemical reactions. We know the meteorology in that grid cell, and we let the winds carry the pollutants downwind to people. And this is very complex and very computationally expensive, even without machine learning. Statistical models are also used in our research group and by other atmospheric chemists. And here we're just simply trying to understand the relationships between meteorological variables and outcomes like smog or smoke events. And this is a picture of the campfire in 2018. And machine learning can help us with both these modeling approaches. You notice that these are huge grid cells on the left-hand side. We can make them smaller and smaller, but then we start ramping up the computational time. And machine learning can actually cut the computational time that these traditional large 3D models use. And then the second way that machine learning can help us is that machine learning can help capture the really complex nonlinear relationships between meteorological variables and something like wildfire activity or strong heat events. So I'm going to talk about one example that we've done recently in my research group, looking at wildfire and what's driving wildfire. We know that wildfire in the western U.S. has increased, and we want to know why. How much of that is just due to natural variability? And this one plot here shows the area burned by wildfires from 1992 to 2020, and the observed area burn is in that black curve. And you can see an upward trend, not surprising if you've been aware of what's happening with fires in the West. But you also see a lot of interannual variability. It just changes year to year. And that's because the weather is changing year to year. And then we use machine learning to understand how these weather variables affected the burned area every year. And we further use climate model output. I won't go into all the details, but you can see the red and orange bars are our attempts to model fire activity, the area burned by wildfires in the West. We're able to capture a lot of the variability during these years. And the red indicates the area burned due to climate change, the orange due to natural variability by our estimates. And so altogether, we found that climate change accounts for as much as 2/3 of the area burned by wildfires in the western U.S. since 1992. And our work is really important because it shows this sort of unforeseen consequence of climate change. We've known about sea level rise, we've known about heat waves, and now we're learning about wildfires and its huge effect. Its huge effect on people and populations and the large impact that climate change has on it. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Beery. I'm also with Avi, an assistant professor at MIT. But I'm in the electrical engineering and computer science department and the computer science and AI lab. And my work focuses on a different dimension of the natural world, which is biodiversity. But we do look at some of these kind of intrinsic ties between biodiversity and climate in both directions. So my big goal, which is very big and is not something a single person could possibly undertake in a lifetime, is that I want to be able to monitor biodiversity, so monitor all species on Earth, and detect change in biodiversity across species, globally and in real time, so that we can just better understand the incredibly complex system that we are all sort of participating in. And I'm not the only person who's interested in this. So we've seen a real explosion in the last 20 years, but definitely in the last 5 years, in terms of different diverse modalities of data that are used to sense biodiversity. This is everything from, similar to some of the other panelists, satellite imagery, but used for a different purpose, but also low-flying aircraft or UAV imagery, things like LiDAR, hyperspectral. On-animal sensors are becoming increasingly available. There's a researcher at University of Washington who just built cameras you can put on bees. There are stationary sensors, huge networks of things like trail cameras or camera traps, passive acoustic monitoring to detect and track changes in birdsong over time. And then increasingly, one of the hugest components of biodiversity monitoring comes from passionate community members, or citizen scientists. So any of you ever use iNaturalist? Hey, I hope that all of you go and start thinking about using iNaturalist. It is so fun. And iNaturalist is essentially a way that you can all go out, take pictures of plants and animals you see. They get identified by the community to the species level, and then those become species occurrence records in the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And just in the last 10 to 15 years, we've collected 290 million species observations through iNaturalist for over 500,000 unique species, which is amazing and is massively outstripping all of these other sort of components of biodiversity monitoring. But one of the things that makes it really hard to think about how do you understand something like an ecosystem is that none of the things that we are measuring directly. So everything is proxy data, essentially. You can't go out and put a temperature probe, or you can't put out a species probe like you can put out a temperature probe. So we get point clouds, pixels, sound waves, DNA measurements, and then all of those need to be processed efficiently into something like a scientific observation that then we can model or interpret or do some sort of analysis on. And this is really why I have a job, I think, because as that amount of data is scaling, this is just impossible without some form of automation. And modern methods in AI, things like computer vision, are really the only types of models we've found that have the capacity to be able to do this processing across the diversity of change, bias, complexity of all of these different data sources. And currently, AI models, including some models that I've developed, are actively being used for biodiversity monitoring. So one example is we have a model that just does a very robust job of detecting animals in camera trap data, humans, animals, and vehicles. This is used by about over thousands of organizations globally. One example, Idaho Department of Fish and Game uses this to process about 11 million camera trap images a year with a team of only 4 people. And these are all kind of human-in-the-loop, human verification systems where you have AI do the easy stuff and humans do the hard stuff, which is generally when we think about AI that's actually being used in practice for anything high risk, there's some requirement for a dimension of human expert verification. And then I also think a lot about how to enable this space to grow. Because currently the bottleneck is very much capacity. We have huge amounts of data. There's a ton of interest. There's so much work to do, but there aren't a lot of people who have the right interdisciplinary knowledge that understand enough about the ecology, the biology systems, the sort of questions, the types of errors that are most problematic, but also have the capacity in machine learning and in some of the methodology. And not everyone needs to be a machine learning researcher, but we need good, robust applications of machine learning that are aware of and take into account some of the dimensions of failure of machine learning models. And so I think a lot about this, and I have a program that I run. It's actually explicitly directed at capacity building from the other side. So taking people who have built a huge amount of knowledge and experience in ecology, and then teaching them how to do robust applied machine learning. But I think there's need for the other way too. So I'm currently teaching a class at MIT focused on PhD students in computer science and kind of trying to teach them what are the dimensions of methodology in AI that are most important for this specific application area. Stuff like handling severe imbalance in your training data, bias and variation and change in all of the systems you want to model, because the only consistent thing in the world is change. Cool. So I also, if you're interested, I run a Slack channel called the AI for Conservation Slack, and it's a really great place to kind of see opportunities, get involved, learn about all the different things people are doing. There's about 2,500 people on there globally, and it's a really amazing community. All right, I think we can just chat now.
Thank you, guys. I actually joined that Slack channel a few years ago and didn't realize that I was actually going to be here with, with this individual. I think my first question is going to be around scale, right? I think as data scientists, we all deal with changing scale, right? We want to get to a micro pattern and then be able to scale it up and be generalizable. And I think climate, biodiversity, sustainability, this is an area where this like really holds true. So if you guys wouldn't speak to maybe one of your bigger challenges you have around, really trying to identify maybe micro level physical processes or getting down to like a smaller grain of, the temperature sensors, and then being able to scale that to some kind of global conversation.
My experience more has been the challenges of working with data at that scale. The world is so diverse, you can't simulate a world within a world. The more you go down into smaller and smaller scales, the larger the data volume becomes. So I think that's completely changed the way I do science at this point. I also realized I forgot to put up my resource page, which was related to a summer program to teach the world how to use computational tools for climate science. And all of that has stemmed from trying to come from the smallest physical scales that I look at to look at global data and work towards a global community that understands these problems. So I really think that relationship between the physics and the large-scale climate, or the scientific community and the global community that's being impacted by climate change, has really directed the way I think about approaches towards scientific discovery at this point.
Sure. So we in the atmospheric chemistry community have begun relying on machine learning to describe very small-scale processes. But there's a problem, because even we don't understand exactly what those mechanisms are. So like cloud formation and cloud droplet evaporation, it's very hard for us to understand what happens where, how do aerosols, little particles in the air, influence cloud formation. And so when we want to train a machine learning model, we can use observations, we can use other more traditional models, but we're kind of in the dark. We don't know exactly how to train and whether our results are any good, because we have an incomplete understanding of these tiny processes. Another difficulty is that we want to train our machine learning models using existing data, existing models, but the Earth is changing and we're moving into a new climate regime, and we can't we can no longer count on the same relationships, the same conditions occurring again. We're going to be outside the envelope of the training data. So those are two of the issues that we have regarding these small-scale processes.
So one thing I think is really interesting when we're talking about these dimensions of scale is I do not think this is at all limited or unique to the climate problem. And one of the things we're seeing more and more is kind of a centralization and almost like a globalization of the development of AI. And, you know, of course, there's a lot of different dimensions of accessibility, like, you know, who has the capacity to sort of train foundation models. But I think that there's a huge amount of prioritization that gets built into foundation models just based on the way that we decide to evaluate them. And so one of the things that I've run into is that while global foundation models often can be shown to be globally useful in some sort of aggregate sense, almost always, if you actually move down to the scale at which someone might make a conservation decision, at the scale of something like a national park or a single state, there's enough diversity or dimensions of shift between that global distribution and the local distribution of a decision maker, and also sometimes the spatial and temporal scales that they might be operating at, that the relative value of a foundation model really starts to diminish. What we find is that the best possible models for decision support tend to be specialized models on specialized regions in specialized time periods. And this is truly sort of a bit of a dichotomy, because we're investing a lot of resources in sort of the creation of these global foundation models, and they are incredible for supporting certain types of use cases. But then actually when we want to move to decision support for thinking about something like an ecosystem, a global model of tree canopy height is almost useless, unfortunately. And so one of the things we've been really trying to figure out is how do you actually think about sharing that value across these kind of scales? And in what ways can a foundation model be helpful? And how do you think about the adaptation or the specialization of a foundation model so that it's actually adding value and you're not sort of seeing this weird behavior where at some point, oh, we're going to start from pre-training from this big model. We're going to fine-tune on local stuff. And at the point where you get enough local data to be accurate enough to use, the difference between training from scratch is zero.
Amazing. Thank you, guys. I think as data scientists in general, I will go on ad nauseum about how important scale is for all data science work, right? And how we kind of see the similar pattern. So I'll just also give a plug for anyone who's still a student to take classes in environmental science or something like that, because that is a space where you kind of deal with the scale problem in such a meaningful way, and it's really complex. It's really helpful in any field, I think. So on this note, you know, as we've seen, computing power, modeling, now AI have this, you know, continual improvement and big push. What are some benefits you guys are seeing in each of your fields coming out of kind of this increase in ability? And maybe also, you know, to some of your points, your increase of data.
I think for my application, the biggest thing has been speed, which is equal resolution in a lot of cases. So that means that we can look at bigger models, long-term projections at a very high resolution. So example, one of the simulations that we're looking at right now is one of the first GPU-based models, whereas normally climate models tend to be run on CPUs. A lot of them use Fortran as language, which I feel like this crowd might appreciate it, but in my department, no one really understands. Sorry, it's recorded. But what that really means is that now we can push forward and using models that are 100 times faster, that look at resolutions that are 100 times higher. That means that we can access information that we didn't have before. And on a global scale, that means that we can now provide more accurate predictions for maybe communities that didn't have access to that knowledge before because they couldn't afford to run this large models or regional simulations that are applicable to climate change in their area.
Yeah, in my area, I think similarly, it's been efficiency. But actually, it's less efficiency in terms of the scale of computation and more efficiency in terms of human time. So historically, these are all data streams that were being processed manually, right? A human, often an undergrad, would sit and look through millions of images for a year, just trying to find all of these sort of objects of interest for a given research project. And so this ability to kind of build these selective prediction, human-in-the-loop systems, and increasingly flexible systems where you don't need to sort of train one model for a specific use and then collect different training data for another use. You can kind of think about, how things like human language can enable more interactivity with enormous scales of data. That type of efficiency has been a huge benefit. And is, I think, one of the reasons, or one of the areas where we've really seen AI shine. But I also think there's a ton of opportunity beyond just data stream processing in the ecology and environmental science space. And we're just starting to scratch the surface in terms of actually thinking about being a bit more scientific about the process, less of just an engineering tool, and actually how do we discover new information, new traits, new relationships between species, collective behavior, at sort of these very large and very small scales. And so I think there's a lot more on the table than we've been able to access.
Thanks. So with regard to atmospheric chemistry and the benefits, the first benefit is the same that Abigail mentioned, that using machine learning can really speed up some of these processes. Once we've trained our model, we can really have a lower computational cost than we would have with traditional modeling with parameterizations or physics-based approaches. The second advantage, second really huge benefit, is that machine learning can uncover very complex relationships between different variables, different environmental variables that would be hard to do with your traditional statistical packages like regression or something like that.
Can I ask her a question? Yeah. So that's so cool that you're finding that you can discover these kind of complex interactions and relationships. But I'm curious, how do you actually kind of peel back the hood and sort of interpret the relationships, especially as these models become more nonlinear, more complex?
That is difficult. Yeah. No, I want to acknowledge the difficulty of interpreting results from a machine learning model. We can rank the importance of different environmental variables influencing a specific outcome, like smoke pollution or wildfire activity. But we do have difficulty understanding the exact mechanism, the actual physical mechanism. But what we're finding is that machine learning can point the way towards real-world observations, real-world analysis of what's happening in the environment.
So you get a provided hypothesis that you can then go design the right ground level study to test. Yeah, right. Quite cool. Kind of like AlphaFold, I guess.
Like what?
The protein folding work.
All right. Unfortunately, we are running low on time. I knew we would. This would go too fast. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience to see if anyone has questions here. This is a really interesting space to work in, data science with kind of, the natural sciences combined. I grew up in the natural sciences and found my way into tech at Microsoft. But it is an unusual path to be able to, Sarah, I think you made the point in your talk to have the skill set in both spaces. Do you guys mind sharing how you ended up where you're at, maybe why you're passionate about it, and kind of the path in 30 seconds or less? No, you can take a little longer than that, of how you arrived where you are.
I'll try to be quick. So I actually also started my path in the natural sciences. I started actually in theoretical math and earth sciences. And I did not know how to code until late grad school. So I was really theoretical. But it's such an exciting time for both climate and for AI. There's so much going on. There's so many opportunities. Everything is new. I think the power is just enormous. So I right now I can't imagine doing science without it because it's really accelerating work. And the whole work now you mentioned foundation models. I mean, imagine the impact this could make on what is really important for the climate sciences and what information people need in order to make informed decisions. So.
Yeah, I had an incredibly windy path to get here. I was first a professional ballerina, and then I thought I was. So when I decided to go retire at the ripe old age of 22 and go back to college, I knew that I wanted to do something that would sort of be of benefit. I really cared quite deeply about serving my community, sort of the world around me. And at the time, I had a pretty limited view of what those opportunities were. But one thing that I was sort of hearing about and seemed quite relevant was the shift to renewable energy. So I decided to study electrical engineering. Now, mind you, I didn't remember how to do anything. I couldn't add fractions, and I went back and was like, I'm going to take calculus. So it was it was a rough time. But actually, it turned out that even though I had hated math in high school, I had a lovely education, but I did go to public schools, and it was in the 90s where we weren't always so good at encouraging girls to do math. When I went back and sort of had a purpose behind the reason I wanted to learn math, I found that actually I loved it. I ended up adding a math degree, and then sort of along that path, my freshman year of undergrad, I got involved in a research project identifying individual snow leopards in camera trap images. And quite prescient of me, honestly, I was like, oh, if we could do this, we could do anything. Like, the ability to process image data is going to change the way we study the world. And so I kind of just took that and ran with it. And those been about 14 years, and I am still working on, honestly, I'm submitting a paper today about interpretability in animal re-identification models. So still a thread. But yeah, it was a windy path.
Thank you, Sarah and Abigail. My path was also winding. I won't go into details, but you can ask me offline. But I did at one real stark career crossroads when I was out of a job. I had a very important conversation with a biology professor from my alma mater, my college. And he said, it's really important. This is decades ago. He says, it's really important that we understand what's happening to our planet. It's really important that we do something to promote environmental stewardship. And his words really stayed with me for years. And so not long after that, I returned to school and eventually followed this path. And it's been hugely rewarding. That's all I'll say for now.
Thank you all. It's amazing. We can open it up, I think, to questions. I think that there are folks with microphones, maybe.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your amazing work. These are super important problems, I think. So I had two questions for you. So one thing is, how much of the predictive modeling can you do for this kind of work? For example, it could be immensely helpful if you could predict where could be the next forest fire or some kind of natural calamity that could save a lot of lives, right? And another thing is that you mentioned that through machine learning, you can find some hidden or latent parameters maybe that could be otherwise undiscovered. So do you have any example of that, where you could find some interesting relations that you could not find with traditional mathematics? Sorry.
Oh, that's probably you.
Hi, thank you for your question. With regard to predicting upcoming bad events, there are predictions for tomorrow, for next week, and then 20 years from now. And there are really fantastic researchers doing short-term predictions. My own work has to do more with long-term. We've looked at fire activity, for example, in 2050, 2100, and the picture is bleak. And we're hoping that our studies will inspire people and policymakers to make changes. But there are indeed a whole set of people who devote their working lives to predicting the next week in fires or heat waves. Your second question, hidden parameters, yes. So in our work, one thing that we've done is shown that the previous year's meteorology can affect fire activity today. So that was not well understood. But we show that, for example, if you have a very rainy winter in the western US, lots of vegetation will grow up. And if that rainy winter and all that abundant vegetation is followed by a dry spring and summer, all the vegetation will shrivel up. And I think we were the first group, this was some time ago now, we were the first group to really show that quantitatively for the western US, that in some ecosystems, the impact of meteorology 1 or even 2 years earlier mattered for wildfire today.
Maybe for the sake of time, we can take another question.
Hi, I'm Dr. Nitika Sharma. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Arizona. I did my PhD in behavioral ecology. And the reason I'm giving you this background is because of my question, which is, I think most data scientists do not think about, it's always about efficiency and not about the carbon footprint or, in the meantime, what are you doing to the environment? But I think it's safe to assume that as ecologists and as environmental scientists, do you also, like me, feel often conflicted when thinking about efficiency? Like you talked about getting fine-scale data that can really help identify species or understand environmental patterns. But I also teach data science and public interest, and I often find myself conflicted because, on one hand, you do want to be efficient as a data scientist, but on the other hand, you want to be mindful of how much that efficiency is going to cost environmentally. So any comments?
Yeah, I think that this is, for very good reason, becoming a much more common topic of discussion. But I actually think that often the conversation loses a lot of nuance. Like it'll sort of treat all AI the same in terms of the computational cost. There is an incredible difference when we think about the climate cost of something like training a foundation model, a large language model, a vision language model on internet scale data with, 750 billion parameters versus training a lightweight computer vision model on a small data center powered by renewable energy that's going to be deployed on the edge directly on a camera to detect the presence of an animal. These are really not the same. And I think it would be really great to sort of try to bring more of that nuance into these conversations, because I think often we over-parameterize the models. The relative kind of gain or capacity from, a larger model versus a small one, not in terms of your benchmark performance, which might, get you that number that gets the paper accepted, but actually in terms of the usability. 2% difference in performance is not changing the usability in many cases. And so we've been trying to introduce metrics actually that try to capture the kind of system level cost, both in terms of like training complexity, inference complexity, and the amount of human time it takes to do the verification, and sort of thinking a little bit more cohesively about like these hidden costs of AI. But I kind of push back against kind of, all data science is equally problematic or expensive, I suppose.
I'm actually going to add to that, coming from the Microsoft tech sector and having moved from there, because I do agree it's very different depending on where you're at. And I think the biggest problem with that is, not in the work that's being done kind of in this climate environmental sector. And it does happen in industry and tech, right? I'm sure many of us have run many costly, computationally costly experiments multiple times a day without a thought of what that is doing with our carbon footprint. So I think it is hard to communicate the importance of that. And then I think also, to our wonderful first speaker in that point too, right? Being more thoughtful at the start of our experiments, right? Rather than just like kind of problem solving along the way, being thoughtful up front is definitely critical. So I'm happy to hear you're teaching that to as many people. I think we have time for another question.
Hi, my name is Hafsa. I'm a senior data scientist at General Mills in the food manufacturing industry. So thank you for sharing your experience, which is the intersection of climate science and data science. So my question is more, for those of us in other industries and not in the climate science space, but as we are all part of the data science community, as we are in this room, what can we do to help solve some of these problems or achieve these goals that you all have shared?
It's a big question.
Yeah, that's a big question. I don't know if I have a good answer. I think maybe that question can be deflected back to you, is what can each one of you do in your private section to make an impact? So maybe there's the interesting and important part about climate is that it's not just one goal and there's not just one way to work on it, and then even just represented by the other panelists here, and in the different universities, there are different people that are working on all sorts of different angles of climate and environment. So this just shows that there's a lot of diversity and there are a lot of angles to approach this problem, and everyone can find a way for them to contribute and in this space of AI for climate. So I don't know if there's one answer, but rather many.
I love that answer, Abigail. And I think that there's kind of a cool way that you could go about this, which is actually looking at the industry that you're in, and then going and doing a little bit of research. Read the IPCC report, the IPBES report, look at the scope 1, scope 2, maybe scope 3 impacts of your industry on climate, on biodiversity. And then with that perspective, often we have the most power in the spaces that we exist in. So perhaps there's ways that you can either through the development of technology or just through advocacy within your own organization, kind of push for more understanding. One of the things I'm doing at MIT is trying to build a biodiversity impact assessment. So, how do we measure not just sort of the climate impacts, but the biodiversity impacts of a large-scale university?
Well, I loved both of your answers, Abigail and Sarah. I'm not sure I can add to that, but I just want to say just 2 words: be brave. Be brave in what you do, and think about what you know best and how you can influence the climate and the atmosphere and biodiversity in the years ahead.
I think we have time for another one. Squeak out every last second. Any other questions? We can probably take one more. We'll go until they kick me off.
Hi, thank you for this great topic. You guys answered a lot of the questions I started to have, and other people asked similar questions. I guess one remaining thing that I would like to know is, where do you think these sources of funding are going to come from for these edge computing cases by all of our research academics? Because like I worked on a grant for NOAA. We were doing webcam surveillance and measuring coastline erosion, and I think that the team that's trying to run that data infrastructure, they're facing a lot of challenges that tech companies can, solve quickly because they're bigger, and we want this information to persist. So I'm kind of curious, like the economics of trying to make this data valuable and evaluated as, climate change data has always been negotiated as valuable or not. So in terms of business. So I'm kind of curious on your, the sources of funding that will help persist this information.
I think we all started sweating, but I'm going to pass.
Obviously there's, particularly as climate has become so politicized, there's historically been a lot of fluctuation in funding for this type of work. But I do think that it's a much kind of bigger challenge, which is how do we actually think about the financial valuation of something like a species not going extinct? This is a very difficult and complex question to answer. And I don't have any concrete answers for you, but I do think that, if we're going to assume that capitalism is going to continue to be the order of the day, then we need to think about mechanisms to give some sort of tangible financial value to something like climate. And this is easier for some types of things like wildfire, because there is a very concrete cost to the human population of a wildfire that affects human infrastructure. And it's much harder for things like the sixth mass extinction of species, right? We're seeing species extinction rates at a higher rate now than the last extinction of the dinosaurs. We are in the middle of essentially the last extinction of the dinosaurs. But what is the capitalistic value of that? It's quite complex. And we're not the only people, I think, grappling with this. I was just recently at MIT in a workshop explicitly trying to bring together economists and biodiversity scientists and data scientists to think about, are there mechanisms for this type of valuation? How do we, and then beyond just the valuation of the thing we're trying to measure, then how do you value the data you're collecting to try to derive the analysis to try to, it's a complicated system.
I don't know what the next few years will look like, but I do see a room full of people that are involved in this space. And I find myself very encouraged to think that there's a lot of tech companies that are getting into the space that do care, that are maybe less dependent on federal funding. So I think that there is a lot of hope that the next generation of data scientists and climate scientists will be interested in understanding this problem and innovating in towards new directions. A little of hope.
And that it is a global problem, so hopefully we have a global network trying to solve it, but it's a hard problem.
Thank you for sharing your work. That's amazing. My name is Hannah. I'm a senior data analyst, and I was just wondering, how can you take the research and work that you guys are doing and put that into providing general population with the education? Because I feel like a lot of times the practical application of something, the general population loses their goals on how they can truly make an impact. I think because come from data, I can realize what I'm doing and my impact, but I don't see that I'm from Louisville, Kentucky, and I really don't see Kentucky being a space that really promotes or educates people as often as they should. So what are some ways that, if I'm going to take something from here and go back and talk about it, what are some ways that you would recommend to educate the general population?
I believe we put together a resource page just for this question. So all three of us are involved in different outreach opportunities that are trying to achieve this goal exactly. So the problem is that a lot of people are very interested. You need very specific skills in order to access data related to climate, biodiversity, and environmental challenges. And there are various different ways to learn more about these systems and get educated, get involved. This is a summer program that I am involved in, which teaches computational tools for climate science. So learn how to access climate data, learn how to understand climate change in the region that you care about. Maybe I'll just step through these and everyone can explain
So this is a summer program at Harvard called SPHERE, Summer Program at Harvard in Environmental and Earth Research. And it's a great opportunity for college students across the country to come to Harvard for 10 weeks to learn data science and other lab techniques.
I already flagged my educational program, but I don't know that these types of programs are serving the entire public. Right. But I think that actually this dimension of community science or citizen science is a huge opportunity for local education and education in the context of your experience, your lived experience. And so, one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot with iNaturalist is not only, encouraging people to kind of be a little bit more observant and aware of the nature around them, but also, we've been thinking with iNaturalist about, if we don't anticipate that policy and regulation are going to happen fast enough for us to protect the areas that we live in and care about, what are the different directions of mechanisms of community-driven change? So through iNaturalist now, there are these things called bioblitzes, which is essentially the community can come together and explicitly go and collect data, but they're starting to add on not just data collection, but also active intervention and management. So they'll do a BioBlitz where you go collect data about the spread of an invasive species, and then you actually actively eradicate that invasive species locally. And I think that this type of sort of on-the-ground, community-driven engagement that is often supported through infrastructure like something like a naturalist, which gives you this platform to share ideas, to learn, can be really powerful.
I think also recognizing this is a space where if you're a master communicator, your skills are needed, just like in any data science space, like data visualization, data communication. This is a space that needs it as much as any other, and it is a really hard problem to solve. Getting people to care about some of these issues, especially when it's not directly visible to us every day in our lives. Well, I think that's all our time. Thank you, panelists, so much. It was a pleasure.